Welcome to the deep dive. You know, where we take your sources and really get into them so you come away, well, seriously in the know, basically. And today we're diving into, well, based on what you sent us, a really huge moment in U.S. history. The New Deal, it wasn't just some policies, right? This was reshaping how Americans saw their government, their whole relationship to it, basically.
Oh, total change, yeah. So we're going to be looking at these reforms, the economic ones, social, political, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Between, let's see, 1933 and 1938, it was a direct response, very dramatic, to the Great Depression. That started in 1929, of course.
And devastation. I mean, wow, their numbers are just... Manufacturing output dropped by a third. A full third between 29 and 33. Crazy. And prices just tanked. 20% down. You know what that means? Deflationary spiral. Bad news. And the impact on people. I mean, unemployment. It went from a decent 4% all the way to 25%. Can you imagine? 1 in 4 people, no job.
And it's not even just no job at all. A third of those still working, part-time, making way less. So add it all up, nearly half the country's workforce just idle. The whole ability to work just wasted. It's hard to even picture that level of, economic shutdown and the suffering that goes with it.
It really is. And then you've got the financial system, complete mayhem, thousands of banks just gone poof. And back then, big thing, no guarantee on your money. So bank goes under, your savings, gone. And to top it off, no safety net, right? No unemployment checks, no Social Security, nothing to help people.
Agriculture, too, slammed. Maybe worse than some areas.
Yeah.
Farmers' income, down over 50% from 29. Housing, forget about it. Between 1930 and 33, almost 1 million foreclosures, just non-farm ones. Imagine losing your home on top of everything else. Nightmare.
So yeah, people were scared. And not just this is tough, but real social unrest talk. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., remember him? Still rich then. He said he'd give up half of everything just so the other half had law and order. That tells you how bad it felt, right?
It does. And that's where FDR comes in. His big speech, 1932, accepting the nomination, He promises this New Deal. Funny thing is, where that phrase came from, an advisor, Stuart Chase, he'd used it. Rosenman, FDR's speechwriter, stuck it in late. But it was more than just a plan, right? Like FDR said, it was a call to arms, this whole deal.
So he didn't think the Depression was just how markets work sometimes. He was sure it was because the market itself was messed up and demand was way too low. So this Keynesian idea, right, that the government spending can help the economy, he's into that. Meaning the government had to step in big time. But wasn't the idea back then to just let things sort themselves out? What was the argument against that, the laissez-faire thing?
Yeah, before the Depression, it was all about classical economics. Markets fix themselves, government just screws things up, slows down the recovery, let it run its course. That was the thinking. But Roosevelt and his people, they'd read Keynes and others, they completely disagreed. They said the Depression was so bad, you needed the government to break the cycle.
Makes sense. And this New Deal, it wasn't one thing, it changed, right?
Totally. 2 main phases, you could say. First New Deal, that was 33 to 35, mostly about what they called the 3 R's. Relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for the people hurting right then, recovery to get the economy going again, and reform, to fix the financial system so it wouldn't happen again.
Then came the second New Deal, from 35 to 38. So what changed in that second part?
Well, they started focusing more on creating jobs for the long haul and making things better for the elderly, workers, poor folks. Basically taking the first steps and then going deeper. But let's go back to that first phase. It sounds like Roosevelt, he didn't waste any time, did he?
Not at all. The first 100 days, 1933, it was wild. New program after new program, and Congress, they were under so much pressure, the crisis, everyone wanting action. So they pretty much said yes to everything. It's funny, though, some of the big stuff, like the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that actually went through, even though Roosevelt wasn't so sure at first.
That is interesting. I guess it just shows how urgent everything was.
Right.
Everyone wanted something done, even if they didn't agree on exactly what. And that quote from Walter Lippmann about going from panicked crowds to a nation ready to act, that really captures the feeling at the time.
It does. And one thing they focused on right away was fixing the banks, the Emergency Banking Act. That was in 1933. That was the first big step. So what did that actually do?
It gave the Federal Reserve a lot more power to stabilize things. They could loan money to banks that were struggling. They could regulate them more tightly. And the big thing, it started the process of federal deposit insurance. That was really important for people to start trusting banks again after so many had just, disappeared.
Right. And then those famous fireside chats. His speech about the banks, March 12, 1933, That must have been pretty powerful, huh? Just the president talking to everyone so calm, explaining what was happening. And of course, he had just shut down all the banks that bank holiday. What was the point of that?
It was a timeout, basically. All banks closed. Nobody could take their money out. Gave the government a chance to figure out which banks were okay and make a plan to reopen them. It stopped the panic. And then the 1933 Banking Act, that made the deposit insurance permanent with the FDIC. Before this, bank runs, they were a huge problem. When people didn't trust a bank, they all ran to get their money out, and that could actually make a perfectly good bank go under. The big change after this was that Americans stopped being so scared of bank runs, which had really hurt the economy, and the whole system got more stable.
It's like, if everyone thinks it's going to happen, it will happen. And some economists, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, they said that all those bank runs, they really shrunk the money supply, which made the Depression even worse. And you're right, the number of banks that just failed, it's hard to believe.
It was crazy. But when they reopened the good banks, with the Treasury watching them and the promise of loans from the government, and Roosevelt being all reassuring in his fireside chat, things changed. People put their money back in the banks, billions of dollars.
Wow. People actually started trusting the system again. And then the Glass-Steagall Act, that was another big one, right? To try and stop things from getting so unstable again.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So the Glass-Steagall Act, it basically stopped commercial banks from doing all these risky things with securities. It separated them from investment banking. And it made the FDIC official, setting the deposit insurance at $2,500. And you can see the difference right away. Way fewer bank failures, much safer.
Okay, so on to monetary reform. Seems like that was another area where Roosevelt did some pretty big and maybe kind of surprising things, like going off the gold standard in 1933. That was a big deal, right?
Yeah, it was a huge change from how things had always been done. Basically, they disconnected the dollar from gold. First, by stopping gold from leaving the country, and then by saying people couldn't own gold anymore. This meant the government had a lot more control over how much money was out there, the money supply. They could try things to fight deflation, which was killing the economy.
So by letting the dollar, do its own thing on the global market, and then setting a new price for gold in 1934, a higher one, $35 per ounce, right? That was all about giving the Fed more power to fight deflation and get the economy moving.
Exactly. An economist named Christina Romer, she said this was really important for boosting industrial production in the years after. The basic idea was if they could stop prices from falling all the time, then they could break out of the deflationary spiral and get things going again.
And since the stock market crash was kind of the start of all this, they also passed the Securities Act of 1933 and then created the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, in 34. Sounds like the big idea there was making the financial markets more transparent so people could see what was happening.
Right. The Securities Act made it so companies had to tell investors all the important financial details when they were selling new securities. Much more transparency. And then the SEC, they became the watchdog for the stock market, stopping manipulation, making corporations tell the truth, all to bring back trust in the market and prevent another crash.
And one thing they did that probably made a lot of people happy was ending prohibition in 1933. But it wasn't just about, people wanting to drink, was it? It also meant more tax money for the government.
Yeah, there were a few reasons. A lot of people were against prohibition anyway. And the government desperately needed money, so taxing alcohol made sense. Plus, Roosevelt had promised to repeal it during his campaign, so it was a political win, especially in the cities.
So let's talk about relief efforts. With all these people out of work, they needed help right away. The New Deal programs tried to do that, but also get people working again, right?
Yeah, the first thing was helping people who were really struggling. But the programs, they didn't just give out money. They often created jobs, building stuff the country needed, like schools, roads, water systems.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that the military was involved. Army guys were running the CCC camps, and the Public Works Administration, they even built warships and planes with their money.
Huh. I hadn't thought about that connection. Speaking of building big stuff, the Public Works Administration, the PWA, seems like it really changed the way America looks.
It did. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, that's what created the PWA to do these big public works projects. And it spent a ton of money, like $3.3 billion just between 33 and 35 on over 34,000 projects. We're talking government buildings, airports, hospitals, schools, roads, bridges, dams, you name it. And the idea was, like you said, priming the pump. get people working, get money flowing.
And a lot of those things are still around today. It's like a real physical reminder of the New Deal. Now, agriculture, that was another sector that got hit hard. Seems like Roosevelt and his Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, they really wanted to help farmers.
Oh, absolutely. They thought the whole economy depended on agriculture being healthy, and the poverty in rural areas, especially in the South, was really bad. So they had all sorts of programs, things like the Resettlement Administration to help struggling families, and the Rural Electrification Administration, which brought electricity to tons of farms. Even programs like the WPA and the NYA, they helped out in rural areas, doing things like school lunches, building schools and roads, planting trees, all sorts of stuff.
And then there's the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. That seems like a really big, ambitious project.
Yeah, it was huge. They built a bunch of dams, generated a ton of electricity, and really tried to modernize the whole Tennessee Valley, which was one of the poorest parts of the country.
And the Farmers Relief Act of 1933, that gave farmers money to grow less. The idea being less food, higher prices, right? And it seems like it worked pretty fast. Farm income almost doubled by 1937.
It did make a difference. You got to remember, before the Depression, farmers were producing way too much food. Prices were dropping like crazy. The Depression just made it worse. You had all this wheat rotting in Montana, sheep just dying in Oregon because it cost more to transport them than they were worth. Crazy.
It's awful to think about. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, that came in May 33. That was the one that tried to fix the overproduction problem.
Yep. The AAA paid landowners to not grow crops on some of their land, and the money for those payments came from a tax on food processing. They even did some pretty controversial stuff to get prices up to what they called parity level, basically making sure farmers got a fair price for their stuff compared to other goods. They plowed under cotton that was already growing, they destroyed other crops, and, the one everyone remembers, they killed millions of baby pigs. It was a tough time, a lot of tough choices.
Wow. I can see how people would be upset about that, even if it was supposed to help farmers eventually. But overall, farm incomes did go up, and even regular people's incomes went up, while food prices stayed below what they were in 29. And the AAA, it really changed the way the government dealt with agriculture.
It did. But you're right, there was a lot of pushback against some of the AAA stuff. And in 36, the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. But they came up with a new program pretty quickly that paid farmers to plant crops that improved the soil, instead of just leaving land empty. That was okay with the Supreme Court.
They just kept trying things until something worked, huh? And it wasn't just the AAA. There were all sorts of other programs for rural areas. The Farm Credit Act, the Farm Mortgage Foreclosure Act to stop farms from going bankrupt, the Rural Electrification Administration, a whole bunch of stuff. And even the food stamp plan in 39. That was another new idea to help both farmers and poor people in the cities by making sure everyone could buy food.
Absolutely. And that food stamp plan, it had support from both parties for a long time. It helped farmers by creating demand for their food and helped poor folks in the cities eat. It's a good example of how interconnected everything was, something the New Deal was trying to address.
So we talked about relief efforts to help people right away and efforts to fix agriculture. What about the overall economy? Did it actually get back to normal? It seems like most things were pretty good again by 1937, except for unemployment. That was still a problem.
Most economists agree with that. And one interesting thing, an economist named Price Fishback, he's done research that suggests all the government spending actually helped people's health. Like fewer babies died, fewer suicides, fewer people died from diseases.
Huh. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Okay, so one big part of getting the economy back on track was the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. That sounds like a really big deal. What was the idea behind it?
The NRA was a big part of the early New Deal. In the first few years of the Depression, prices just kept falling. Deflation. Businesses were desperate to stop it. And Roosevelt's people, they thought all the competition between businesses was actually bad for the economy. It meant too much stuff being produced, wages going down, and prices dropping, which meant people didn't buy as much. So the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, it created the NRA to raise prices, make unions stronger, and get rid of what they called bad competition.
And that NRA Blue Eagle campaign, that was all about getting businesses to agree on these codes of fair competition, right? So everyone would have minimum wages, maximum hours, and agree on how much to produce.
Exactly. It was a huge effort to get every business in the country on board with these agreements, with the government backing them up, basically government-approved cartels. And at first it seemed like it was working. Production went up a lot. But as time went on, it got really hard to manage. It was too big and complicated. And some people said it favored the bigger companies.
And the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional in 1935, right? In that Schechter Poultry case.
Oh.
But even though it didn't last, it seems like the NRA had some lasting effects, like the idea of minimum wage, maximum hours, no child labor. Those things came back later.
Right. That's important to remember. The NRA didn't last long, and it had its problems.
Yeah.
But, like the historian William Lichtenberg said, it did do some good things. It created jobs, it helped stop deflation, it made businesses act more ethically, and it started those important labor standards. It's complicated, but it was important. And there were other things happening with labor during the first New Deal. They passed the Wagner-Peiser Act, which created public employment offices all over the country, and the Anti-Kickback Act to protect workers' wages on government projects.
And they changed the Railway Labor Act to make company unions illegal. It seems like right from the start they were trying to do more for workers.
Definitely. And Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, she was really important for pushing those labor initiatives. She organized big conferences to get states to pass minimum wage laws and other worker protections. And she created the Division of Labor Standards within the Labor Department to make working conditions better everywhere. And you saw stuff about labor in other laws, too, like the Russell-Shoals Act. The U.S. even joined the International Labor Organization, so there was definitely a growing awareness of workers' issues.
Okay, so now housing. It seems like they wanted to get people building more houses, which was good for the economy, and make it easier for people to own their own homes. They were building on some things Hoover had started.
Yeah. The Public Works Administration, they had some plans to build public housing. But the private sector really pushed back. They didn't want the government doing that. So most of that funding went somewhere else, except in New York City, where they did build some public housing. But the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, that started in '33. That was really important. They kept a lot of people from losing their homes. They did it by refinancing mortgages, making appraisals more consistent, and simplifying the whole mortgage process.
And then there's the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. That came a little later. They were more focused on setting standards for building houses and making mortgages easier to get so more people could buy homes. But there's a really bad part to this too, right? Redlining.
Yeah, that's a really important and sad part of the story. The HOLC, when they were making their maps to decide which areas were safe for giving out government-backed mortgages, they discriminated. They basically drew lines around neighborhoods and said, these are risky, we won't give loans here. And the main reason they did that was race.
So they just looked at a neighborhood, and if it was mostly black people, they said, nope, too risky.
Pretty much. Neighborhoods with, how did they put it, inharmonious racial groups, basically black people. They were marked in red or yellow sometimes, meant they weren't getting loans.
And this wasn't just like a few people doing this on their own, right? The FHA, when it was created, it made these discriminatory practices official policy.
Yep. And the consequences were huge. Black families couldn't get mortgages, so they couldn't buy homes, which meant they couldn't build wealth like white families could. And if you lived in a redline neighborhood, forget about getting a loan for repairs, so those neighborhoods just got worse. And get this, the government even said that new developments had to be segregated if they wanted government backing. And they encouraged using those racially restrictive covenants and deeds to keep neighborhoods segregated.
It's hard to believe. Even when they were trying to help people, racism was still a huge problem. So the third R of the first New Deal, that was reform. This was about fixing the problems that caused the Depression so it wouldn't happen again.
Right. The idea was the free market, on its own, it was just too unstable. The government needed to do more to keep things steady, regulate things, and make sure everyone had a fair shot.
Yeah.
You know, farmers, businesses, workers.
And one of the reforms was trade liberalization. With the Reciprocal Tariff Act of 1934, it seems like more and more people are realizing that those protectionist policies, like the Smoot-Hawley Act, they actually made the Depression worse for everybody.
Most economic historians think that's true. And Roosevelt himself, he'd spoken out against Smoot-Hawley when he was campaigning. The Reciprocal Tariff Act, that was Cordell Hull's baby, the Secretary of State. It was a big shift. It let the president make deals with other countries to lower tariffs. It's seen as the start of more open trade policies globally.
Interesting how those early changes sort of set the stage for how things worked after World War II. We should also mention the Puerto Rico Reconstruction Administration. That was all about helping Puerto Rico during the Depression, right?
Right. The PRRA, they focused on things like land reform, creating farming cooperatives, and supporting local industries. They were trying to help with the poverty and unemployment there.
Okay, so that's the first New Deal. Then in 1935, the second New Deal started. Seems like that was because of some of the problems they ran into, criticism of the programs, and maybe people wanting even bigger changes.
You got it. The Second New Deal, it was definitely more progressive, and it definitely made more people mad. It happened because the Supreme Court was shutting down some of the first New Deal programs, and Congress wasn't always on board anymore. And I think people just felt like they needed to do more, make bigger changes to fix things.
And I think the most famous part of the Second New Deal is Social Security. Hard to imagine life without it, right? But back then, the U.S. was really behind other countries when it came to helping people.
Oh yeah, for sure. Before Social Security, only a few states had anything like old age insurance. And even those weren't very good. Only Wisconsin had unemployment insurance. So Social Security was a big deal. It meant everyone would get old age insurance, what we call Social Security now. And it created unemployment insurance and help for people with disabilities and poor kids. It was the start of the modern welfare system.
And Roosevelt really wanted Social Security to be funded by payroll taxes, right? He wanted people to feel like they earned those benefits, so it would be harder to get rid of.
That was the idea. He knew it was important for people to feel like they had a right to those benefits, that they weren't just charity. That way, it would be harder for politicians to mess with it. Another big thing in the Second New Deal was labor. The National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act in 1935, that was huge. It finally gave workers the right to form unions and bargain with their employers as a group.
And that led to a lot more people joining unions, especially in the big industries. Labor became a really powerful force in politics, supporting the New Deal.
Absolutely. The Wagner Act also created the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. They're the ones who run union elections, investigate when companies don't follow the rules, and help unions and employers negotiate. It didn't force companies to give unions what they wanted, but it gave workers a way to fight for better pay, better conditions, more benefits. And even though there was some fighting between the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, unions got a lot stronger during this time.
And it wasn't just factory workers. They also did some things to help farm workers, like the Jones-Costigan Act and later the Sugar Act. Those had stuff about child labor, working hours for kids, and they even let the USDA set minimum wages for some farm workers.
Yeah, people were starting to see that farm workers needed protection too. And in the Second New Deal, they passed a lot of laws to make things better for workers in all kinds of jobs, like the Public Contracts Act or the Walsh-Healy Act. That set standards for companies that had government contracts. They had to pay minimum wage, overtime, they couldn't use child labor or prison labor. And then there was the Anti-Strikebreaker Act, the Burns Act. That made it illegal to bring in people from other states to break up strikes. And they changed the Davis-Bacon Act to guarantee fair wages on public works projects. And the Miller Act gave construction workers and suppliers the right to sue if they didn't get paid. The Motor Carrier Act that let the ICC limit how many hours truck drivers could work to keep them and everyone else on the road safe. There was a lot more. For sailors, railroad workers, even apprenticeship programs. They really tried to help workers in every industry.
Sounds like they were really changing how the government treated workers. And they didn't just focus on workers, they also tried to protect consumers from companies that were cheating them or tricking them.
Yeah, definitely. The Public Utility Holding Company Act in 1935, that was to protect people from those big utility companies. The Federal Power Act in 35, that was about making sure people got reliable electricity and other utilities. The Natural Gas Act in 38, same thing for natural gas. And one that really matters for everyday people, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. That gave the FDA a lot more power. They could test drugs and cosmetics before they went on sale, and the Department of Agriculture could set standards for food. And then there was the Wheeler-Lee Act, that gave the Federal Trade Commission more power to go after companies that were doing shady stuff, not just to protect other companies, but to protect consumers.
So the government was stepping in to make sure companies weren't taking advantage of people. And then, of course, there's the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. That was a huge program to try and get people back to work.
It was massive. The biggest thing anyone had ever tried for unemployment relief. Harry Hopkins was in charge. Roosevelt wanted him to focus on projects that would benefit the country in the long run, but he also said they had to pay less than private companies so they wouldn't compete. And the scale of it, unbelievable. Over 8.5 million people worked for the WPA. They built so much stuff. Roads, buildings, bridges, reservoirs, parks, you name it.
Like famous landmarks we still use today, right? The Lincoln Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, LaGuardia Airport, the Overseas Highway in Florida, the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. The WPA really changed the way America looks.
Totally. And it wasn't just those big projects. There was the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA. They brought electricity to millions of farms. In just 5 years, the number of farms without electricity went way down. And then there's the National Youth Administration, the NYA. They helped young people get work and education. Lyndon Johnson, he was involved in the NYA in Texas when he was younger, and that probably influenced his Great Society programs later on. And the WPA even helped artists. The Federal Project #1 in New York City, they gave jobs to writers, musicians, artists, theater people, although some conservatives thought they were communists.
So the Federal Writers Project, they wrote those state guidebooks and collected historical stuff. They gave jobs to people like Zora Neale Hurston and Anzia Zierska. The Federal Theater Project, they put on plays that were cheap or free. And the Federal Art Project, they hired artists to paint murals and make sculptures that you can still see today. It was a huge investment in people and culture.
It was. And in the Second New Deal, they also changed taxes. The Wealth Tax Act, or the Revenue Act of 1935, they put a really high tax on the richest people. It was probably more about showing that they were trying to make things fairer than about actually getting a lot of money. And some people think it was a way to stop Huey Long from getting too popular. They raised the top income tax rate a lot, although it only really affected a very small number of people.
And the undistributed profits tax, that was in 36. What was that about?
Mostly about getting money to pay World War I veterans. They passed the Adjusted Compensation Payment Act to do that, but it also meant that companies had to pay taxes on profits they kept, instead of giving them out as dividends. The idea was to get companies to invest more, but businesses hated it, and they eventually changed it so it wasn't such a big deal.
So they were trying different things with taxes to help the economy and make things fairer. And they also passed the Housing Act of 1937. What was that one for?
That created the United States Housing Authority. They were part of the Interior Department. They were supposed to get rid of slums and make sure poor people had decent places to live. One of the last big New Deal laws.
So if you look at politics back then, the New Deal really changed things. Progressive and conservative started to mean different things depending on how you felt about Roosevelt.
Definitely. People who liked the New Deal, they called themselves progressives, and people who didn't, they were conservatives. At first, Roosevelt had a lot of support in Congress. They were mostly liberals, elected in 32. That's how he got so much done so fast. But in the 38 midterms, the Democrats lost a lot of seats, so Congress became more conservative, harder to work with, especially about labor stuff. Back then, the Democrats, they had a lot of Southern Democrats who were pretty conservative, but there were also a lot of liberals, especially from northern cities, and they wanted the government to do more. Roosevelt needed those big majorities in Congress to pass his laws. From 34 to 38, most of Congress was happy to spend money. But after 38, it changed. You had conservatives from both parties teaming up to stop the New Deal from going any further. And you got to remember, the first New Deal and the second New Deal, they were different. The second one was more radical, and that's why more people were against it.
And then there was Roosevelt's plan to change the Supreme Court, right? The court packing plan. Why did he want to do that, and what happened?
Well, the Supreme Court kept saying his New Deal programs are unconstitutional. So he wanted to add more justices to the court. Officially, it was to make it more efficient, but everyone knew he just wanted to appoint justices who would agree with him. It didn't go over well. Republicans and conservative Democrats, they all hated it, so it didn't pass. But it was a big deal. It showed that people were getting tired of the New Deal. But eventually, some justices retired, and Roosevelt got to appoint new ones, so the court became more favorable to his stuff.
And just when things seemed to be getting better, the economy tanked again in 37. What happened there?
Yeah, the recession of 1937. That came out of nowhere. Production went down, profits went down, unemployment went up after getting better for a while. Economists still argue about what caused it. Some say the Federal Reserve tightened up the money supply too much. Others say the government cut spending too much. Whatever the reason, it was bad news for Roosevelt politically. People started saying the New Deal wasn't working. It made his earlier claims that things were getting better look bad. It's interesting, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, he said that maybe the New Deal didn't go far enough. He thought the government needed to spend a lot more, but that's really hard to do politically, except during a war.
And that's the thing. The U.S. didn't really get back to full employment until World War II. But even so, the New Deal, it changed everything.
For sure. A lot of the New Deal programs are still around today, still using their original names, like the FDIC, the SCIC, the FHA, the TVA, and the two biggest ones, Social Security and the SEC. They're still super important. And even Eisenhower, he was a Republican, but he mostly left the New Deal alone. He even expanded some parts. And Lyndon Johnson, his Great Society programs, they were inspired by the New Deal. There's been some deregulation since the 70s, and they got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act in the 90s, but the New Deal really changed how Americans see the role of government.
Well, that was a real deep dive into the New Deal. It's amazing how much they did, how much it affected people's lives. And now you, dear listener, you know a lot more about the New Deal, the different phases, all those programs, and all the arguments about whether it worked or not. We really got into those sources you gave us.
We did. So here's something to think about. The New Deal, it's still important today. People are still arguing about it. What do you think is the most important thing we can learn from the New Deal? What worked? What didn't work? What's relevant to today's problems? What surprised you? Let us know what you think.